All Swedes should mentally. Will a war in Scandinavia come? After all, with the largest population and the highest gross domestic product (GDP) by a margin, Sweden is often considered the most powerful and influential among the Scandinavian countries. So if Sweden is seemingly gearing up for a war against Russia, will all Scandinavian countries follow in its footsteps? That's what this video will look into. It will also dissect how ready Scandinavian nations are for war. After all, a heightened mental state of readiness means nothing if the physical and logistical aspects of preparedness are lacking. But before we go any further, we must define the Scandinavian nations we'll be discussing. Why? Because the country's ties to Sweden in all matters, civil and military, are what makes Finland particularly relevant for this video. So as far as we're concerned, Finland is part of Scandinavia. However, there haven't been any explicit mentions of wars between these countries in recent history. So what changed? The answer is simple. Russia invaded Ukraine. With most Scandinavian countries being relatively close to Russia, Finland even shares an 832-mile-long border with the country, they basically have a front-row seat to the atrocities unfolding in the region. But Scandinavian countries aren't looking the other way. On the contrary, they're laser-focused on what's happening to Ukraine and what could happen to them. That's why Sweden and Finland joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, after years of self-imposed neutrality. This can also be considered a reason as to why Scandinavia is preparing for war against Russia. It now has a united front in the face of a perceived national threat. A quick comparison between Russia's and Scandinavia's military capabilities should answer this question. Spoiler alert, even when combined, Scandinavian countries don't even come close to Russia in most aspects. Take the country's military budgets as an example. Sweden spends the most on defense among the Scandinavian nations, which is about $7.6 billion, or 1.3% of its GDP. Norway is next with $7.3 billion, which is 2% of the country's GDP. Finally, we have Denmark with $4 billion and Finland with a $3.3 billion military budget. Russia alone spends $65.9 billion on defense. And that's not all. The Russian government intends to spend as much as $160 billion on defense, which would surpass 10% of its GDP. However, things do look up a little in the reserve military department, as the Finnish defense forces maintain a sizable reserve force of about 900,000 personnel. Add the 31,300 from Sweden, 63,000 from Denmark, and 40,000 from Norway, and Scandinavia can at least muster over half of Russia's 2 million reservists. Regrettably, the same can't be said for any of the military equipment in these countries' army, navy, and air force. Let's do a quick overview to help you understand just how huge the difference between these potential war players is in this department. Since Russia shares quite a lengthy border with one of the Scandinavian nations, let's tackle the land forces first. First up, tanks. Russia boasts over 12,000 tanks, while the Scandinavian nations have under 500 together. With 200, Russia's neighbor Finland has less than half this number. Scandinavia has slightly better odds in the armored fighting vehicles department, as Denmark has over 4,000, Sweden and Finland over 2,000 each, and Norway over 550. But then again, Russia has over 24,000 of these vehicles on its own. As for the artillery, we're back to abysmal figures. Russia's total artillery strength is approximately 18,266, a far cry from Scandinavian assets, which at best go over 800 in Finland. Now you might think these numbers aren't really relevant, as a vast majority of Russian land forces are deployed in Ukraine, and that's absolutely right. However, its air and sea forces remain intact. So let's take flight for a second, though you'll probably want to land again as the situation in the sky is even more lopsided. Russia boasts an impressive fleet of almost 4,500 aircraft. This figure includes 1,665 helicopters, 689 attack aircraft, 340 fighter aircraft, 384 multi-role aircraft, and 100 unmanned combat vehicles, UCAVs. As for Scandinavia, the total number of aircraft between all four countries is just under 600. The breakdown is even more dreary, as the Scandinavian countries don't possess the same aircraft capabilities. However, these countries are well aware of this fact. That's why in March 2023, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark moved to create a unified Nordic air defense and significantly strengthen its numbers. To this end, Norway ordered 15 more F-35 fighter jets to add to its existing 37 ones. Finland has 64 F-35s on order and 62 FA-18 Hornet jets in store, and Denmark will add 27 F-35s to its fleet of 58 F-16 fighter aircraft. So the situation in the sky seems somewhat optimistic, but what about the sea? If we take our hypothetical battle to the sea, Scandinavia might stand a chance, as its total number of naval assets is almost 500 compared to Russia's 653. However, in areas where numbers truly matter, such as aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, Russia wields significant superiority. The Scandinavian countries, on the other hand, either have none of these crucial vessels or fall in the single-digit zone. Though these numbers sound bleak, the worst is yet to come. No Scandinavian country possesses a single nuclear weapon. In contrast, Russia has roughly 6,000, placing the country at the forefront of global nuclear capabilities. Of course, we must note that the absence of nuclear weapons in Scandinavia is intentional, reflecting a long-term commitment to being a nuclear weapon-free zone. Of course, Norway and Denmark have long waited for their Scandinavian neighbors to join them in NATO, as these countries have been a part of the alliance since its very inception. In fact, Norway and Denmark are among the 12 founding member countries of NATO. With this in mind, let's briefly discuss the cooperation between NATO and the Scandinavian countries to understand the importance of all four nations being a part of the alliance. First up, Norway. Norway has been quite an active NATO member since the alliance's formation. It participated in several NATO operations, including the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia and the 2011 military intervention in Libya. The country also sent troops to Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks. Norway's national delegation to NATO includes high-status personnel from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. However, when it comes to Russia, Norway has followed a reassurance policy since the Cold War, limiting the presence of NATO past the 28th longitudinal zone, close to the Norwegian-Russian border. Of course, it's highly unlikely this policy will hold under the new geopolitical circumstances. The next in line is Denmark, a country that went from being neutral for decades to becoming a founding member of NATO. How is this possible? Well, it's simple. Following 2 world wars, Denmark stopped viewing neutrality as foolproof security assurance and opted to consider other solutions. The first option emerged between the 2 world wars, and it involved joining all the Scandinavian countries, plus Iceland, in an alliance. After all, these countries shared centuries of history, similar democratic values, and a strong culture of consensus building. Unfortunately, World War II forced them to shelve these plans and ultimately pushed Denmark to NATO. However, the country only joined NATO on 3 conditions. Number 1, NATO won't establish permanent military bases in Denmark, with the exception of Greenland. Number 2, NATO will respect Denmark's commitment to a non-nuclear weapon policy. Number 3, there will be no allied military activity on the entire territory of the Danish kingdom. Finland's NATO membership almost doubled the length of the alliance's border with Russia. You can draw your own conclusions. But let's focus on the more positive aspects of this story. Sweden finally became a NATO member on March 7, 2024, and according to many experts, NATO is precisely where Sweden has belonged all along. After all, Sweden connects the Baltic region to the transatlantic link and can play a key role in deploying and transporting Allied combat forces. But will Allied combat forces need to be deployed through Sweden and the rest of Scandinavia? In other words, how likely is it for a fully fledged war to break out between this region and Russia? If we were to look for an answer in the past, it would probably be very likely. After all, Russia and Scandinavia, and for that matter, the newest NATO members, Sweden and Finland, haven't had the best history. As many Swedes will tell you, Russia has always been perceived as an enemy. The same can be said for Finns, who consider Russia a serious security threat. And how could they not? After all, Finland and Russia fought battles on several occasions, including the Winter War. After World War II, Finland lost roughly 10% of its territory to the Soviet Union, which forced it to relocate 11% of its population, about 400,000 people. The country also had to pay approximately $300 million in war indemnities, which is as much as $5.3 billion at current exchange rates. Though the subsequent period was focused on avoiding any potential conflicts with Moscow, nothing can erase history. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Scandinavian people have had the chance to remember why they dislike Russia, as the country started using a series of grey zone tactics in the region. These tactics refer to sly and unconventional moves made to provoke a nation without crossing the threshold into open armed conflict. For example, in November 2023, Finland had to close its borders to Russia after a massive surge of asylum seekers. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo labeled this move as instrumentalized immigration in retaliation for joining NATO. Gunilla Herolf, a senior associated research fellow at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, also claimed that Russia has the ability to stop Sweden from functioning through cyber attacks and sabotage operations if it chooses to. But let's go back to the primary question. Will Russia and Scandinavia cross this odd threshold they currently navigate and go into an open-armed conflict? Truthfully, it depends on who you ask. Those who believe that a war is imminent think so because of how unpredictable Putin has become. Plus, Russia's president is seemingly determined to create a new Europe, one where might is right, as Pål Jonson, Sweden's Minister of Defense, puts it. That's why Jonson believes that a Russian attack on Sweden can't be ruled out. However, others believe that Russia won't attack Sweden. But don't be fooled, this doesn't mean that there won't be an attack. It only means that Russia's target will be another Scandinavian country, Finland. This possibility primarily has to do with Finland's long border with Russia, which creates numerous opportunities for border clashes that can escalate in no time. And let's not forget, after Finland was accepted into NATO, Russian officials warned that this country would be the first to suffer in case of any conflict between Russia and NATO. However, those who believe no conflict will erupt in Scandinavia write off these threats as nothing but posturing. They believe that Russia has already lost too much in Ukraine to start another war in Europe. Of course, this war wouldn't be in anyone's best interest, as it could have severe consequences for all parties involved, and let's face it, the entire world. But Scandinavia isn't the only potential war zone when it comes to Russia. The Arctic region has attracted many a troubled gaze for this very reason. In his 2023 speech at the Arctic Circle Assembly, Rob Bauer, the chair of the NATO Military Committee and Lieutenant Admiral in the Royal Netherlands Navy, stated, "We must be prepared for military conflicts arising in the Arctic." Still, many experts believe that a full-blown military conflict in the Arctic won't likely take place or be instigated by Russia. After all, Russia has too much to lose in the far north, thanks to all the military equipment stationed in the Arctic and the country's numerous resource-extracting projects. But then again, we're talking about Putin. a man who never knew when to admit defeat. If backed into a corner by the growing might of NATO, who knows how Russia's unpredictable and unreliable president might react, especially when you consider that any potential for diplomatic dialogue has long ceased to exist in Russia's case.